people could take their seats, please. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Urban Schooling's 6th and final William Waters Symposium on Urban Education. Before we begin this evening, we would like to acknowledge that we are presently located on the traditional lands of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. The name Toronto means meeting place, as this region was also the meeting place of many other First Nations peoples who use this land. My name is Jeff Kugler. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Schooling here at OISE. I'm really happy you're all here tonight to join us in an important discussion on how to move schools and schooling forward in finding ways to better serve the needs of all students. At the Center for Urban Schooling, we believe that it's our obligation as educators to work towards ensuring an equitable education system that does not racialize and marginalize some groups of students based on certain aspects of their identity. We need to work together towards an education system that works to ensure that all students achieve success at school. A bit of history. We began these symposia thanks to the generous donation of William and Phyllis Waters. On behalf of everyone here, I would like to thank Bill and Phyllis Waters from the bottom of our hearts for making this all possible. Thank you. And everybody should know Bill's sitting in the front row. This is the 6th Waters Symposium organized with the support of that donation. And it is unfortunately the last. I just want to take people through the significant work of the last 6 years. And please take note of our amazing titles. I'm proud of our titles. We began in 2009 with a lecture by Professor Michelle Fine, and this was her title, she made this one up, titled, and it's a great title, When Objects Become Subjects, a 25-year journey from laboratory experimentation to ethnography to participatory action research with youth. Pretty good? In 2010, the symposium highlighted Dr. Lisa Delpit with a lecture, again her title, Mining for Diamonds with Other People's Children. The 2011 symposium was titled, and this was our title, Institutions Out of Sync, Pressure Points for Change, and brought together 4 speakers, Professor Jim Cummins, Professor David Holchansky, and representative of 2 racialized communities in Toronto, Fawzia Warsami, a member of the Somali community, and Gina Sani, a member of the Roma community. In 2012, the title was Activism in Education, Pushing Limits in Increasingly Conservative Times, again our title, with speakers activist Judy Rebick and Professor James Banks. 2013 saw a focus on urban Aboriginal education, titled Beyond the 3 R's, Troubling, Reconciliation, Restitution, and Resurgence, brought together 3 Aboriginal educators and activists, Ellen Gabriel, Professor Diage Alfred, and Professor Susan Dion. Pretty good titles. Which brings us to the 2014 Waters Symposium this evening. Beyond Goats and Charity, Culturally Responsive and Relevant Pedagogy, Theories and Practices for Systemic Change. And I have to say, I love that title. I hope it will help us to push our thinking and therefore our practices forward in ways which promote a more fundamental reframing and change to what are current common educational practices. The Center for Urban Schooling has been working hard over the last 6 years in our work with schools on redefining culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy within the Toronto, Ontario, and Canadian context. We thought it was important and timely to highlight culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy as the focus for the Waters Symposium tonight. Over the years, the William Waters Symposia have attracted close to 3,000 educational equity activists to its public lectures and seminars, and we are very proud of this accomplishment. Before I introduce Vanessa, I would just like us all to get a bit of a sense of the audience. So if I call out who you are or what you are, or at least part of who you are and what you are, just raise your hand. If you are a K-12 teacher, raise your hand. Ooh, a lot of K-12 teachers in the room. If you are a university professor or instructor, raise your hand. A good number of them too. If you are a student, raise your hand. A good number of them too. And the little baby student at the back. If you are from a community-based organization, raise your hand. Good number. If you are from an administrative position in a school board or from the Ministry of Education, a few of those too. That's great. And if you are none of the above, raise your hand. Okay. So it's a really amazing, great mix of people connected to education in all kinds of ways. Before I finish, I need to let you all know that I myself am retiring from OISE at the end of June. It's been a great privilege and pleasure to have worked together over the last 8 years with so many people, many of you present here tonight, to help to build a strong and vibrant, activist, equity-based urban education focus to discussions and practices in urban schools in the Toronto area. I'm now happy to introduce Vanessa Russell, the William Waters Teacher in Residence in Urban Education. Over the last 3 years, she was the William Waters Teacher in Residence. As the funding for the symposiums comes to an end, so does the generous Waters funding for a Teacher in Residence. So there's no more Teacher in Residence after June. We have both former teachers in residence here with us tonight, Karen Murray and Vanessa Russell. They have been critical and essential components of the ability of the Center for Urban Schooling to have done the school services work that we have engaged in over the last 7 years. It has been a joy to work with Vanessa on visioning and organizing this year's symposiums. Her contributions are enormous, and without her energy, thinking, and wit, this symposium could not have happened. Please welcome Vanessa Russell.
Thank you. As the William Waters Teacher in Residence, I would also like to extend a big thank you to Bill Waters for making it possible for the Center for Urban Schooling to engage in this dialogue tonight. This is the third and last time that I have had the privilege to organize this event, and once again, it's thrilling to see so many of you here tonight. I have to admit that my emotions are a bit mixed. Endings are never easy. Importantly, I'd like to acknowledge that although I have relied on a village of support to make this event a reality during my tenure, it is Jeff Kugler who has worked most closely with me. Together, we have negotiated the ups and downs of planning an event this size, sometimes through laughter, sometimes through tears, and sometimes through fighting like siblings. And I will miss this important work that Jeff and I do together. Our theme for tonight evolved over time and many conversations. We recognize that beyond goats and charity is a bit cheeky on our part. It isn't so much about poo-pooing charity. Charity absolutely has an appropriate time and place. However, we want to acknowledge that charity per se is not enough in a freedom project which seeks to create equitable and transformative change in schooling spaces and beyond. For that to happen, we must begin and continue to explore institutional structure and exclusion and to dismantle systemic and individual barriers to fairness. We must have the political will to create the resources, both human and material, to support those folks who are most disadvantaged by such systems. Tonight you will learn about the structures and barriers connected to disproportionality in special ed, to deficit thinking in relation to students and families from particular communities. At the same time, you will hear more about pushing back and challenging these barriers. One conceptual framework highlighted tonight is culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, and it is certainly no coincidence. For many years now, the Center for Urban Schooling has been morphing and enriching this framework by broadening the meaning of culture and thinking about this work within a Canadian context. CRRP is one important vehicle open to educators in working to better support racialized and marginalized students and to close the significant achievement gaps. CRRP helps us all interested in education to understand the systemic issues connected to inequitable educational opportunities and outcomes and allows educators to work for systemic change. To begin our evening program, we center a vital and necessary component, that of student voice. This year, the Center for Urban Schooling partnered with the Toronto District School Board's Teacher, Learning and Leading Department in a module of learning entitled Diversity of Voices. To describe this project in more detail, give a context to the art gallery, both on the stage and outside the auditorium, to give a shout out to the artists in the audience and the teachers in the audience who are attached to this project. I'd like to introduce you to the program coordinator of Teacher, Learning and Leading, the fabulous Karen Murray, who, as Jeff mentioned, happens to be the first William Waters teacher in residence and my predecessor here at OISE. Please help me welcome Karen to the stage.
So good evening, everyone. And let's have a call and response because we have spoken word about to happen. So good evening. Good evening. Much better, much better. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited about tonight because not only around the topic that we're talking about, but also how it relates to the work that we do in the Toronto District School Board. So as Vanessa mentioned, we had an amazing module of learning this year, one among many. But this one really talked about student voice. And we wanted to center this module in a space where we really take this idea of being culturally responsive and relevant away from it's something the teachers do to this is something the students say. Because what we found in our work, and we've been doing work with culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy for 3 years, is that critical consciousness, the tenet you're going to hear when spoken tonight by some of our featured guests, is the hardest one for people to work with because it asks us to push around issues of politics, issues that deals with privilege, issues that deal with power. So over the last 4 months, we had 18 schools in our board where we had teachers who had the absolute amazing opportunity to work not only with us, but with the Center for Urban Schooling and with community artists to explore how to use techniques, art techniques, like visual arts and spoken word as vehicles for students to be able to express issues that are relevant and related to their lives, topics about their identity and who they were. So we worked really hard with this, and we were in kinder classrooms. And I met one of the kinder artists outside taking a picture of her work. And we worked with secondary classrooms, and we worked with every classroom in between. So I just want to take a few seconds just to say this too. I can't name all of my teachers because we had close to 30. But I definitely want to put in the space the names of those amazing artists whose work you'll see outside. So in terms of visual arts, we have Karen Harkins, she is here, Jeanette Kavanaugh, Erica Ezeroff, Leslie McHugh, and my partner in crime, Vanessa Barnett from the TDSBs. Can we give them a hand, please? And in regards to our spoken word artists, we have Kwanta Misangwa, who's here. We have Dwayne Morgan, Wendy Motion Brathwaite, and of course, Louise McConnell, who goes by Spin, and you're gonna see him in a second. So can we give a hand to my spoken word artists as well? These amazing community artists worked with these teachers to bring classroom spaces where kids were able to talk about what they were interested in, things that was relevant to them, and things that really mattered. And I want you to spend a little bit of hearing what some of those amazing words were. So we're gonna start with our primary junior, I'll say that, from William Burgess. I have two young people who's gonna blow your mind. First of all, we have Kaya Kaba and Justine Gray. Can I call them both to the stage, please? Let's give them a little hand. Okay, I'm going to set them up. I was told very clearly that Kaya's going first and Justine's going second, and that's what Justine told me. So Kaya, can you move forward and can you share your voice, your poem, your poetry with this group?
Hello, citizens and memory makers of Toronto. I am Kaya Kaba, and I am here today not only to run for mayor, but to make Toronto better and make great memories. My parents are just like the millions of people who have built this country up from the ground. They are immigrants. Like many of you, I am mixed. I also know how people are treated just because of who they are. I am Kaya Kaba, and I say storied past, bright future. I have many goals, but my main goals are transit, housing, jobs, and anti-racism and criticism. I will make the 401 bigger, and the DVP will be double-decker to reduce crowding at times during rush hours. I will focus on building a better transit system, as the one that we have now has failed us. We're squishing in like sardines in subway trains. We need to have a better system reaching to the suburbs and downtown. We cannot keep interchanging and squishing in like sardines at Bloor Yonge Station. We need more buses, more subways, and the badly needed DRL subway line. I will make better high-quality transit stops with next vehicle arrival timers, even though looking at a clock won't make things go faster. I am also very eco-friendly. All buses that run on diesel will be sold and retired to buy eco-friendly buses. My second goal is to build homeless shelters for people in Toronto. Even more. We have all these nice things and they don't even have a roof. We need to give them a roof, hot water, and food. Many people are looking for work, and some can't even get a job at McDonald's. We need to build stores and make more government jobs so people can get money and have a house, even if it's just minimum wage. My last goal is to stop racism and criticism against Black people and people who are gay, lesbian, etc. I will make a pilot program called Peace Officers to go around your neighborhoods, and you will be fined $150 if you are caught in the act of being critical or being racist. You will be fined $150. So, will you join me to make Toronto better? Will you help me make Toronto an inspiration from Bangkok to the UK? From the UK to Mexico? Help me make society better as it has failed us now. Thank you.
Now, he isn't really on the ballot, but we can always petition that he could be. Very good, Kea. Let's hear from Justine.
These are 10 things about myself. My skin is peach like the ripest peach in the world. My hair is as brown as a cup of hot chocolate. My freckles are light brown like French vanilla flavored milk. My eye color is as blue as blueberries. I am not wearing jewelry like an undesigned mannequin. My hair to my shoulders is like the length of a ruler. My eyelashes are short and straight like a Boston Terrier's fur. I am 9 years old like 9 pears on a tree. I am a beautiful female, like a fashion model, and my name is as rare as a black leopard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justine. And before these two students leave, I would be remiss not to thank their teachers, Donna Service and Stacy Langdon. Can you stand up for a second so they could just say hi? Oh, is Jennifer here? And Jennifer Zerba, the principal of William Burgess, is here as well. So let's give a great big round of applause for our first two of our voices from our students, Kea and Justine. I can't do justice to our secondary group, but I'm going to introduce Spin to welcome them on the stage. Spin, please come.
Bit of a height difference. Round of applause, please, for our amazing performers starting out. I want to thank Karen for giving me this amazing opportunity of a lifetime to do this workshop and work with these incredible poets you're about to hear from. I actually had the privilege of going back to the high school that I barely graduated from, and hopefully made an impact. So people laugh, but this whole notion to me has been very important, and I'm very confident that marks are going to shoot through the ceiling, courtesy of the work that the artists have done, because we've been able to connect on a culturally relevant level with these students. And I've seen motivations, I've heard feedback from their teachers. I'm thankful for all the artists and the love and care. And I want to ask you to please give a strong round of applause to the teachers that have supported us in their classrooms. Now, with that said, the night is not mine, so I do want to ask you, OISE, we have 4 poets making their debut tonight on the microphone. Please give a strong round of applause as I call them up to the stage. Dominic Nanton from Oakwood, please, round of applause. Travis Mitchell coming to the stage. Lataya Smith coming to the stage. And Darren the Sage coming up to the stage. And without further ado, you'll be hearing the 4 poems in sequence. Feel free to interact and motivate them and give these artists all your love and support. And we're calling up Dominic Nanton to set it off.
Thank you. A round of applause to Spin. I I'm Dominic, and I'm here to share my poem with you. They just want to see me. They want to see me fail. I remember cracking jokes, sitting 10 years, I think you'll be in jail. Even though it was a joke, to me it didn't feel funny. I never felt the need to laugh. I felt the hate inside. The pain was incurable. It was terrible. You seem to know me, so tell me where I came from. Tell me how hard my mom worked just to save some. They want to see me at the bottom, but I'll never finish where I started at. She told me to keep my head up, and that helped a lot. I headed one year on my back, because it seems like a damn itch I can't reach, and I'm dying to scratch. But I got my motivations, and they're the reason why I just smile when a fool starts hating. Why can't they all just want to see me? See me be the man that deep down I'm dying, I'm desperate to be? Well, for all that's on my side, I will never turn my back on you. That's why I write this poem for you. Thank you.
Hi, let's say it one more time for Dominic. My name is Travis. The poem I'm about to show you guys is called Still Grieving. Wish I could go back to the days Grandpa was still breathing. Years gone, I'm still grieving. Looking at him in his dying bed was the worst feeling. The pain's not healing. Hearing his voice when I'm sleeping. Still hear him say, that's the way it is, boy. We all have to go someday. As he lay, waiting for the day cancer take him away. Ran out of church with tears in my eyes. Grandma decided to cry as a coffin passed by. My aunt got weak in her thigh. Couldn't stand the pressure of saying bye-bye. Try to stay strong, hold on, until 1 week later, news hit. The boy used to run around with called it quits his life. He took it over time. I was overwhelmed by stress, desperately striving for happiness, never settling for less. I picked up my chest, forced my way out the mess. With the help of my moms, my life is at its best. Hopefully in the eyes of God, I passed the test. Hopefully my success put a smile on my old man face. Sitting in the land of grace, the lessons that you taught me did not go to waste. If you listen to this right now, I gotta say something I never got the chance to say to your face. Thank you. Thank you for the love and peace you brought to my heart. Thank you. Thank you for the whips you put on my back to set me on track. To those listening to this, I didn't write this for your sympathy. I wrote this as my testimony to honor the man that played a big role in building me. Yes, to honor the man that helped make this fearless, ambitious guy that you all see. Thank you, Granddaddy.
Let's give another round of applause for Travis and Dominic. My name's Atea, and the poem I'm going to read to you is called A Girl Without a Father. This is a message. This is a message, a dedication or a new life lesson to all those brothers and sisters and only children hurting, to all those with deadbeat dads. A girl without a father. A girl without a father. I'm that girl without a father. A deadbeat, low-life, disfigured man with a familiar face in my head but an unfamiliar spot in my heart. I'm supposed to be your favorite little girl, your pearl, the baby girl you spurl, tore, and whirl with. But I'm not. When I see all my girlfriends through the daddy's right-hand man and asking me, where's my dad? It's just sad. It's just sad that a man like you can't figure out the clue that it's not okay to find a quick replacement for a baby sister who might not like the new arrangement. And you can't just place my brother and I in the basement for your own personal entertainment. And who is this baby girl anyways? My sister? She's just a fucking blood blister with a tongue-twisting name. 2 or 3-year-old girl. Who cares? 'Cause I don't. But I do. But I'll never tell you that. I'll never tell you the hate I have for your young daughter is eating me alive. I need to take a 5 from all the lives, the cries, the pointed knives, and the hating, and just try to survive. If that means I have to put a fake smile on my face, I will, because the will of family is way more important.
I need to understand the fact that my sister was just added to an equation that was already complicated. And I want her to realize we might not talk, but it's not your fault. I won't ever be ready to explain this equation to you because I ain't ready to accept the truth. Really hope my brother doesn't become like my dad, who's a dysfunctional, disfigured man. I hope he becomes a great man that can support his family. And this is me, a girl without a father.
Wow, there's a lot of people here. Wow. Please give it up for Sister Latia and my two boys, Dominic and Travis. Please give it up for Spin one more time, please. And my English teacher, Miss Barron, who is bawling out her eyes. Please give her a big round of applause. Before I get into this poem, I don't know if you guys heard, but Pink Day, which was last week Wednesday, it was a day to commemorate and raise awareness towards bullying, towards teenagers of my age and children who are younger. And being a victim of bullying earlier in my life, it's something it's really something that's really soft to my heart. So I really hope you guys like my poem that I wrote for you guys. So enjoy, please. Gays and lesbians. Gays and lesbians are people like us, but yet they're treated with violence and such by people who hold prejudice and such. I raise my fist to empower those around me to rise up together and lead a charge into the yard of those same haters who hate on other people's family members. Martin Luther said he had a dream that one day people will be able to live in peace and prosperity. So why can't that be a reality? I'll tell you. It's because the hatred against the gay community has run way too deep in our society. This homophobia battle has been a long, drawn-out one, but from this day forth, I pledge to make my mark and cut this shit in half and be the man to put this on blast. Others cry when they are treated wrongfully. I'm offering my shoulder to cry on, so let me be your tissue for this social issue. Before death overtakes me, I will make a difference with this and live with the goodness in my heart and die knowing I did all I could. I did all I could. I did what I could.
Round of applause for our poets. Thank you.
First, I just want to thank their teachers, Cheryl Barron from Oakwood and Naomi Savage, who works through arts program within TDSB. And I wanted to say also, so first of all, let's thank them. So let's give them a hand. And I just wanted to end with this. These students are not professionals. These are students who just wrote something down because they had the opportunity to write it. And we had classroom teachers who were open to have conversations that said to these kids, just tell me what you feel, tell me what you want, tell me what is the issues affecting your lives. Imagine if you weren't moved from our William Burgess students, our future mayor, to our secondary students who told you a lot of different things that were affecting their lives. If you're not moved by that, then all the things that's gonna come after this ain't gonna move you after. So take some time when you get an opportunity before you walk out this building to really go look at the artwork that is all out there. We created our gallery from those schools. Some of it's here in the front. Read some of those reflections. Look at what those students were saying. They were vulnerable, they were open, they were honest, and they were just being kids. So have a wonderful evening.
So I just really wanted to get us once again to sort of focus on the potential that this work has. That what we just saw and what you could see in the artwork outside really speaks to what could be happening and should be happening in all classrooms and all schools, certainly in Toronto, but in the country. And unfortunately isn't. And I guess that's part of what this evening is about, figuring out how to move this forward in bigger and more systemic kinds of ways. And just before Vanessa comes up, I just really wanted to thank Karen one more time, because, you know, I've now worked with Karen for, I guess, 5 years. And every project that we've worked on is a project from which I've learned so much, but also I think are projects that push the limits. You know, this was a Toronto District School Board, right? This wasn't some kind of political organization outside that was organizing this project. This project demanded that artists and teachers talk about systemic power issues with kids. And when that happened, the kids did amazing things. And I think it really is thanks to Karen and her leadership that that kind of thing is possible and is a hope for the future as she becomes director.
I now have the privilege of introducing our moderator for the evening. Lance T. McCready, PhD, is Associate Professor of Urban Education and outgoing head of the Center for Urban Schooling in the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at OISE University of Toronto. He is an interdisciplinary social scientist whose research, writing, activism, and community service focus on education and well-being of urban youth, in particular African, Caribbean, Black fathers, young adult offenders, and queer youth of color. Lance has served as principal investigator or co-investigator for several collaborative and community-based research projects, including the Educational Trajectories of Black Male Youth Study, Black Daddies Club Research Project, Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention, Many Men, Many Voices Program, and I Will Survive study on the ways media influences experiences of resiliency for sexual minority youth. His first book, Making Space for Diverse Masculinities, is one of the only book-length critical ethnographies written about the experiences of gay and gender non-conforming Black male youth in urban secondary schools. Please help me welcome Lance McCready to the stage.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thanks to all of the students who perform, and Karen and Jeff and all the staff and faculty who work with the Center for Urban Schooling. I want to offer a few words to flesh out today's symposium topic and then introduce this year's winners of the William Waters Scholarship. Thanks again, Mr. William Waters. And then the keynote speakers. When I came to OISE 7 years ago, I was intrigued by the limited presence of an official discourse on culture and learning in the Toronto District School Board, given the legendary multicultural policies of Canada. Hence, I suggested we, the CUS faculty and staff, familiarize ourselves with the literature on culture-responsive and relevant pedagogy. In educational discourses, culture-responsive and relevant pedagogy describes efforts to incorporate the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference,
and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for them. In contrast to one-size-fits-all approaches to curriculum and instruction, in the era of standardization, culture-responsive pedagogy recognizes cultural background as one factor that can shape how students learn and engage differently within educational spaces. And it seeks strategies that capitalize on students' cultures in order to enhance their learning experiences. Overall, the scholarship on culture-responsive pedagogy has provided an important framework for anti-deficit approaches to educating Black students and other youth of color. I have been awed by the work of Nicole West Burns, Jeff Kugler, Karen Murray, and most recently Vanessa Russell in adapting the American discourses to the Canadian context. I think this work holds great possibility for creating more positive learning environments for racialized and marginalized students who have historically underperformed in the Toronto schools. At the same time, I think it is important to move beyond the work of classroom instruction to understand and actively challenge how social inequalities are produced and reproduced in the context of urban schools and communities. In the words of the late Jean Anyon, one of the most important urban education scholars in the world, the structural basis of failure in inner city schools is political, economic, cultural, and must be changed before meaningful school improvement projects can successfully be implemented. Educational reforms cannot compensate for the ravages of society. With this in mind, I'm truly honored to acknowledge the winners of the William Waters Scholarship for the 2014-2015 academic year. Both have an amazing record of activism in and out of schools and have been judged by students and their peers to be incredible teachers. The first person I'd like to introduce and acknowledge is Darjini Rajeswaran. Could you stand up, please? Is Darjini here? Yeah? Jeannie is a secondary teacher in the TDSB who has taught in a range of schools from C.W. Jeffries to Don Mills Collegiate. And I just want to, I'm shortening their bios. I hope you'll please acknowledge them individually and congratulate them. They're all both amazing scholars. The second person who is a winner of the William Waters Scholarship is Ahmed Ahmed. Please stand up. Ahmed is a well-known activist educator who has worked as a popular educator in schools and community-based organizations. I wish the both of you an amazing year of learning at OISE, and thank you again, William Waters, for making these scholarships possible. Now, on to our keynote speakers. I will introduce each of them before their presentations, and when all four have finished, I will moderate a discussion amongst the presenters, followed by a Q&A from the audience. Here's a hint about the order of speakers. We move from the problem to the pushback. ... First up is Paul Gorski. Paul Gorski is an associate professor of Integrated Studies in George Mason University's New Century College, where he teaches classes on class and poverty, educational equity, animal rights, and environmental justice. He recently designed the new social justice undergraduate program and minor there as well. He has been an active consultant, presenter, and trainer for nearly 20 years, conducting workshops and providing guidance to schools and community organizations committed to equity and diversity. He is the founder of the organizations of EdChange and the Multicultural Pavilion. EdChange works to build equitable and just schools, communities, and organizations through transformative action. Please welcome Paul Gorski.
I guess we're getting the PowerPoint up. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I say good evening, everybody. Good evening. All right. I'd like to thank the symposium organizers, first of all, especially Vanessa and Jeff, who have taken very good care of me. I'd also like to once again recognize the youth and let you all know that I aspire to have the courage that you have someday. That is a goal of mine. It's an honor to be here with you and to be on this panel with some folks who are doing really incredible work. I've worked over the last 20 or so years on a lot of different issues related to educational justice, racial justice, work around economic justice and poverty, sexual orientation, religion, language. I've done all sorts of combinations of those sorts of things. I've honed in recently on the issue of class and poverty, for a number of different reasons. One of those reasons is that I feel like in the educational equity world, I feel like in some ways we don't do a very good job talking about any of these issues. But often I find, and I've done this work all over the world, 5 continents, many different countries, and the one thing that I find is fairly common is that we seem to be particularly stuck when it comes to issues of class, and also the ways in which class and race intersect with each other, or class intersects with other sorts of things. And so I'm going to talk about the issue of deficit ideology, but I'm going to talk about it particularly through a class lens, because my experience has been, again, that the deficit lens is a very popular lens in schools right now for a lot of these different issues. But the way that it comes out most clearly, I think, is around poverty and class. And I'm also going to say before I jump into this, I'm from the US, and the US has exported a lot of awful things in the education world. But among the awful things the US has exported is somebody named Ruby Payne, who right now is, and this is part of what drove me to this work, that the dominant voice in the US right now, and increasingly in other countries, on issues of class and poverty, is somebody who draws exclusively from a deficit lens. And so I was sort of pulled into this because in the US, Ruby Payne has been in 70% of school districts. And I'm going to share a little bit about her work here in a second. And the problem, though, the problem is not Ruby Payne. The problem is the ideology that people already have, so that they look at somebody like Ruby Payne and look at her deficit model and the culture of poverty model and say, yeah, that's what we need in our school. We need some more of that. So I start with the premise that the poor are not the problem. And this is an ideological issue. This is an ideological issue. I think the biggest stumbling block we have right now for creating equitable and just schools for low-income students is that a lot of very well-intended people think poor people are the problem. That we go by addressing educational outcome gaps by fixing poor people rather than by fixing the things that disenfranchise poor people. And I think we could say the same thing about race. I think we could say the same thing about a lot of different issues. This beautiful young woman here is my grandmother, who grew up poor in the Appalachian region of the United States, and coal mining. My mom's side of the family has a legacy in the coal mines, so very poor, very, very poor people, but still adorable. Would you not say that? Is that not the most adorable grandma? So when I start hearing the common discourse about poor people don't care about education. Well, grandma was the valedictorian in her high school. Poor people don't care about their children. Poor people are violent. Poor men are criminals. Poor women are promiscuous. The first time I started hearing those sorts of things, and I thought back to my own family, I thought, that doesn't match my experience at all. And so the big problem we have, the big overriding problem we have, is how even some of us, the most well-intended, equity-minded among us, can get sucked into these discourses that makes us believe that the best way to address educational inequities is to fix the people who are the targets of the inequities rather than fixing the structural inequities. And that's the shift I think we need to make. So I start with three major assumptions. The first one is that poor people bear the brunt of almost every imaginable social ill. Again, there's a lot of intersections with immigration and race and a lot of other things. But the other thing that's interesting is that poor people end up being blamed for the very inequities that target them the hardest around economic conditions in a country and that sort of thing. So again, that is sort of a social training, and I'm going to talk about that social training in just a second. My second starting assumption is that I'm not saying it's every second grade teacher's responsibility to take up the mantle against global poverty, although if you look around this room and we all organized around that, I think we could do some pretty interesting work. So I'm not saying that every teacher has to feel the weight of that giant work on her shoulders or his shoulders. But what I am saying is that as a teacher, as an administrator, whatever my role is, if I don't at least understand the impact that bigger social inequities have on low-income students, on students whose families are in poverty, I cannot be an effective teacher for low-income students, and I cannot be an effective administrator for low-income students. So again, the point here is not to put this pressure. I think already the problem is that teachers often are being blamed for the outcomes of these big social conditions, and that I think is problematic. But for teachers and administrators to be able to think critically and broadly enough to understand that those big conditions do impact low-income students. I want to talk about a few of the other sort of barriers to progress around creating equitable and just schools for low-income students. One of them, sort of big level here, is thinking that we can eliminate this thing that people call the economic achievement gap without eradicating poverty. We can't. That is an impossible project. It is an impossible project because all of the ways that people experience poverty have, and I'll show you some of those in a second, have an impact. And if we don't address those issues, those bigger structural issues, we are not going to eliminate those gaps. Plain and simple. Secondly, thinking that we can eliminate the economic achievement gap by fixing poor people rather than by fixing the things that disenfranchise poor people. Again, that's the deficit view. I'll talk about that in 1 second. And then finally is mistaking what is actually an opportunity gap for an achievement gap. I think the very way that the terminology that's used, and again, I think this is something that's sort of being exported by the US and other places, is this sort of achievement gap framework that makes it really easy to look at families. We'll blame families, we'll blame disenfranchised people. And so this is a shift, recognizing that what we might think of as an achievement gap really is more of an opportunity gap. And then, of course, the popularity of the culture of poverty notion and the resulting deficit ideology. And again, I think part of the issue too, and I know other people are going to address this, I think part of the issue is that we're stuck on the notion of culture. So if you look at all of the models, all of the frameworks we use for talking about this stuff, we have multiculturalism and interculturalism and cultural competence and cultural proficiency, and also the culturally relevant pedagogy and those sorts of things. And the problem is not necessarily with those frameworks themselves or the potentials of those frameworks, but the problem is that often those are operationalized in ways that focus on very sort of vague notions on culture and do so in ways that avoid talking about a bigger conversation like equity. And that's what's been so important about Lisa Delpit's work and Gloria Latson-Billings, is that they frame things like culturally relevant pedagogy in a bigger conversation about educational equity. I'm going to talk about what I see as kind of the dominant view, definitely the dominant view in the US, and based on what I hear about Ruby Payne and the culture of poverty model becoming more popular here as well. The culture or mindset of poverty model The first thing that we have to understand about that was that it was debunked about 50 years ago. It's a model that comes out of the work of a social scientist named Oscar Lewis, who studied small communities, small poor villages in Puerto Rico and Mexico, and basically made a list of cultural attributes that he attributed to poor people. And they're the same things that you hear today. Poor people don't care about education. Poor people are violent. Those sorts of things. Within about 10 years, Charles Valentine wrote a book, some of you might have read it, it's called Blaming the Victim. How many of you have heard that term, blaming the victim? That term was actually coined in response to the culture of poverty model, specifically in response to the culture of poverty model, the model that's used by Ruby Payne and others today. And one of the big problems with the culture of poverty model is it leads us right into a deficit ideology. Now, the function of the idea of deficit ideology is that deficit ideology encourages us to look for the problems that exist, to look for the causes of problems in society. If you can think of a social hierarchy, so think about the wealth hierarchy. So you have the wealthiest people at the top and the poorest people at the bottom. The function of deficit ideology is to have us always looking down the continuum when we're trying to understand social problems. So why do low-income students not do as well in school on average? It must be something about their culture. I'm looking down the continuum. The function of deficit ideology is to keep us from looking where we need to look, which is up the continuum. Why are things structured the way that they're structured? Why is opportunity distributed so unequally and so unjustly? That is the function of deficit ideology. And the problem is when I'm looking through that deficit view and I start trying to imagine solutions to things like the economic achievement gap, the problem is the only solutions I can imagine if I'm looking down the power continuum, if I think that low-income students don't do as well in school on average because of deficits in poor communities, then the only solutions I can imagine are solutions that are about fixing poor people, fixing those deficiencies, rather than fixing the things that disenfranchise poor people. And now we're completely off track. And the structures, the power structures, that's exactly what they want us to do. Look down the power hierarchy, down the power hierarchy. Do not look up the power hierarchy. And I'm just going to share with you, just so you get a sense of the ridiculousness of the culture of poverty view. These are quotes. Again, Ruby Payne in the US is the most popular person who does professional development in schools around poverty and education. And I know that she's been in this area, in the Toronto area, working with several of the area schools and that sort of thing. But this is what deficit ideology looks like, direct quotes. The typical pattern in poverty for discipline is to verbally chastise the child or physically beat the child, then forgive and feed him or her. There are people in schools in this city, there are teachers in schools in this city that are getting this to prepare them to teach low-income people. This is what they're getting to prepare them to teach low-income people. That is the deficit view. Also, individuals in poverty are seldom going to call the police for two reasons. First, the police may be looking for them. That is the deficit view. You have teachers right now in Toronto and in Canada more generally, who are reading a book with these quotes in it to learn how to relate to low-income students. And for some people in poverty, alcoholism, laziness, lack of motivation, drug addiction, in effect, make the choices for the individual. That's deficit ideology. That's the ideology we have to learn to catch in ourselves. I was doing this presentation at a conference about a week ago, and somebody said, well, aren't you taking those quotes out of context? And I look at this and say, in what context is that okay? In what context is it okay for teachers to read that, to learn about the experiences of low-income students? And this is part of deficit ideology. It's reading that and the absence of reading about the inequities, inequitable access to healthy food, and equitable access to equal educational opportunity, and equitable access to to the best possible health care. So what I'm arguing for this evening is that we need to make a shift from this culture of poverty or deficit ideology, and in fact, from sort of framing the whole conversation around culture to framing the whole conversation around equity. When somebody says culture, I say, okay, culture, but what about equity? What about equity? And so I'm talking about, I use what I call the equity literacy framework, and you can sort of see the shifts that I talk about here. That outcome inequalities do not result from cultural defects. They result from inequitable access to resources and opportunities. And this third point is a critical point, because I know many of us educators come to forums like this, and we're saying, okay, this is interesting, but give me the 10 strategies. And I'm here to tell you that the problem with that is that this is not a practical problem. This is an ideological problem. This is purely an ideological problem. So if I can't commit to dropping that deficit view, that culture of poverty view that blames poor people for outcome inequalities, if I'm not ready to give up that ideology, no practical strategy is going to help me. No practical strategy is going to help me. I'm going to go through the rest of this really quick because I'm just about out of time here. One of the things I found doing research for a book that I just wrote was a lot of the things about what happens in schools that you can guess have an impact on low-income students, the effectiveness of the instruction and all that sort of thing. But one thing that I didn't expect to find was that one of the predictors of how well a low-income student will do in school is not just about the instruction, but about the attitude, that ideology the teacher has about why poor people are poor. If the teacher believes poor people are poor because of their own deficiencies, that ideology affects everything else they do. It affects expectations, it affects their pedagogy, it affects everything else. Again, that's ideological. That's purely ideological. You can see here some of the out-of-school opportunity gaps. The problem with the deficit view and the culture of poverty view is that it sort of forgets to mention some of these things that have a huge impact on students' experiences in school. Again, you might be a teacher that says, you know, well, that's awful, but I don't feel like that's in my purview. And again, I understand that. But the point is that even if you don't feel like you can change that, that's the stuff that's impacting your students. So we have to understand that. It's about the ideology around that. And then you can also see some of the in-school sorts of issues as well. So finally, our challenge is to reject the deficit view, commit to the ideology. It's not enough to have the deficit view, to have the oppressive view, and then just add a few strategies. That doesn't work. We have to reject the deficit view, understand the structural view, strengthen our consciousness and understanding, our humility around this, and watch for how this deficit ideology crops up in different kind of language. A big example of this right now is grit. All this research that's done about grit. So the idea is we don't have to create a more just system. All we need to do is teach disenfranchised people to be more gritty so they can do better in the oppressive system. That's a deficit view, purely deficit view. And I am going to end there. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is Jillian Parrick. Jillian Parrick is a scholar in critical disability studies and a researcher for the Toronto District School Board. Her current research addresses issues of educational equity and disproportionate representation, institutional structure and exclusion, as well as disability and belonging. Let's welcome Jillian Parrick.
Good evening, everyone. Fantastic. They are learning, fast learners. I just wanted to thank you for having me here today, and a special thanks to Jeff and Vanessa and to William Waters for this opportunity, and to all the fantastic presenters tonight. Absolutely incredible. So part of both my doctoral studies and my current portfolio with the TDSB includes exploring issues of equity within special education, particularly around demographic trends relating to disproportionality. So I'm really happy to be here today to share with you some of the TDSB's data and to add to the discussion on issues of disability, education, and why culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy is important in addressing some of the troubling trends currently seen in special education. Because as we know, schools are critical sites for identity development, and students' experience of place and value can have lasting impacts throughout their adulthood. In the same way, exclusion from rigorous academic opportunities can lead to the reinforcement and reproduction of much larger social hierarchies. So through this lens, CRRP asks us to consider whose knowledge and whose experiences are privileged in our own public education systems. Now, Canadian society is generally supportive of allowing public education to function as a sorting mechanism for the employment sector. A robust capitalist system requires varying levels of valued labor. And Duncan Andrade and Morel state that while not everyone will be happy with their position in the labor market, there needs to be a formal mechanism to justify their place there. Based upon constructed normative measures reflecting white, middle class, and able-bodied minded ideals, deviation from these standards can lead educators and other professionals to perceive or misinterpret such deviance as disordered. Studies examining demographic trends within special education population, and the ones I'm about to show you today, reveal that there is often an overrepresentation of minority students and students living in poverty. So Reid and Knight explain the intersectional relationship of gender, race, and class, and how diverse identities can become conflated with disability. And I quote them here, "Because most people in contemporary society perceive students with impairments as qualitatively distinct, referral, diagnosis, labeling, sorting, and remediating appears objective, fair, and benevolent. One result of perceiving different others through this technical rational lens, i.e. as defective, is that it seems natural that students of color, the poor, and immigrants lie outside the predominant norm and therefore belong in special education." Interestingly, the current model and scientific assessments within education and special education suggest a certain rigorous and measurable approach to ability. However, when we unpack how assessment norms and standards were established, we often find cultural and class bias at the core of their development. As Brantlinger describes, in schools, and I quote again here, hierarchies are structured into meritocracies. Yet in theory, schools are to operate in fair and impartial ways so that children have equal chances to move up in social class rank and improve their life conditions. In reality, educational circumstances are not equal. Wealthy white children inevitably are advantaged. So specifically relating to troubling trends in special education, research tells us that many students identified as having special education needs do not demonstrate any form of pathology. There are some exceptionality classifications that are dubbed high incidence or judgment categories and are most often associated with negative social connotations and parent and student blame. Behavior disorders and mild intellectual disability are also categories in which minority students and students from under-resourced communities are often overrepresented. In contrast, exceptionality categories that are associated with more socially valued characteristics such as brilliance, as seen in gifted, or in autism spectrum disorders, are often overrepresented by white, male, and upper middle class students. So at this point, now that we're all ready, I'd like to quickly take this opportunity to explore some relevant data from the Toronto District School Board. So a little context, how many of you have gone through the TDSB or work within the TDSB or okay. So a lot of you will be familiar with some of this for sure. So the TDSB is the largest school board in Canada, and up until 2 days ago, I was able to say it was the 4th largest in North America, but someone burst my bubble and we're actually 7th largest in North America. We cater to over 250,000 regular day students, in addition to 120 to 140,000, depending on what time of the year you're counting, continuing education students. So every 5 years, the TDSB collects extensive demographic and experiential information on their student population through a student census. How many of you filled out a student census? Oh, a couple of you, okay. Good. We actually do get a really good turnout. Because the student census is actually now the largest youth survey available in Canada. What is unique about the TDSB student census is that while it is confidential, it is not anonymous. Student identification numbers are used to correlate student information collected through the surveys to the TDSB's school information systems, which houses student program, achievement, and other student-related data. So conducting analysis involving student demographics, program opportunities, achievement, and academic outcomes allows the TDSB to closely monitor and create interventions that address issues of equity, access, and social justice. Now, let's see if this works. Okay, so I'll draw your attention here. So the first graph we're going to look at looks at gender across special education categories. And what you'll see here is the green bar are proportion of males, and the yellow bar is proportion of females across categories. And on the very far left is IPRC as gifted, learning disability, mild intellectual disability, other exceptionalities excluding gifted, and students who only have an IEP but no formal identification. And as you can see there is a consistent overrepresentation of boys across each one of those categories. Okay, our next slide. I apologize if this is a little tricky to see. So this graph looks at self-identified ethno-racial status across special education categories. And what I've done here is I've selected the 4 largest ethno-racial groups in the TDSB, which makes up approximately 80% of our student population. The bars furthest to the right of the screen, closest to me here, where it says total, that's the total proportion per ethno-racial group in the population we looked at. And if all things being equal, those proportions should match and be the same going across all those categories. But as you can all see, they are quite different. So I'll sum up what this chart is saying. So students who self-identified as white, those would be students represented by the orange bar, are greatly overrepresented in categories such as gifted and learning disability. Students who self-identified as black, represented by the blue bar, are greatly overrepresented in categories such as mild intellectual disability, students identified with other exceptionalities, and students who only have an IEP. Now, students identified as East Asian, oh, it's too blurry. Oh, sorry, my apologies. Okay, so back over to the far left would be IPRC gifted, learning disability, mild intellectual disability, IPRC excluding gifted, students who only have an IEP, and then again, the categories represented by the bars is that orange is self-identified white students, blue is self-identified black students, green is self-identified East Asian students, and yellow is self-identified South Asian students. And as you can see, there's a wide variation across all of those categories. Okay, this is looking now at income across special education categories. What you're looking at here is along the bottom is 10 income deciles, going from the lowest income decile on your left to the highest income decile on your right. And when you extract gifted, which is that blue line that has a very positive linear relationship to income, because you know, right? When you extract that line, basically the overall is that you are more likely to be identified, or if you are identified as having a special education need or have an IEP, you're more likely to come from the lower income deciles in the city. What this chart masks, though, is that due to all the exceptionalities, excluding gifted, being combined into one, is the vast difference between individual exceptionality categories. For example, differences in income, for instance, between students identified as having learning disability and having a mild intellectual disability are vastly different. And last, for the demographic pieces, we're looking at parent education. So again, looking at the far left, IPRC gifted, IPRC special education needs excluding gifted, IEP only, and students who do not have a special education need. And the one I'll draw your attention to is the goldish greenish bar, and that represents university education for parents. And as you can see, Students who are identified as gifted have a far greater chance of having parents who have a university education as compared to all other categories here. Okay, so from the data, it's evident that some groups are more likely to be identified with special education needs than others. But what are the outcomes correlated to these decisions? What are the trajectories? Here's our more recent suspension data. And as you can see here, at the time of this analysis, roughly 20% of all students in their tenure at the TDSB had had at least one suspension. But that proportion drops dramatically for students identified as gifted, where it was 12.9%. But for students who were identified as learning disability, mild intellectual disability, or other exceptionalities without gifted, and who had an IEP, they basically over doubled in suspensions for each of those categories. And finally, looking at trajectories for for graduation and post-high school. What this shows, again, along the bottom is gifted to the far left, learning disability, mild intellectual disability, and other exceptionalities, and no special education needs. And the orange bar is graduation after 5 years, confirming university is the green bar, and confirming college is the blue bar. And what you see here is that proportionately, students identified as gifted are more likely to graduate on time and confirm university. But these achievement rates drop dramatically for students identified with learning disability, mild intellectual disability, and other exceptionalities. Great. So, as shown in the data, students identified with special education needs, excluding gifted, face inordinate barriers in reaching higher education opportunities. In addition to a population that experiences disproportionate rates of suspensions, academic failure, and school disengagement, there are also populations who face inordinate sociodemographic challenge. So incorporating pedagogical approaches that account and appreciate student diversity is key in addressing issues of disproportionality in special education. Embedding greater CRP praxis within urban schools that target the lived experiences of diverse identities has the potential to disrupt these demonstrated trends and negate future structural injustice for our students. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jillian. Our next speaker is Carl James. Dr. Carl James teaches in the Faculty of Education as in the graduate programs in sociology at York University, Toronto. His research and teaching interests are in the areas of educational and occupational access, equity and opportunities, cultural identification, urban education, youth studies. He is the director of the York Center for Education and Community, and this is a rare opportunity. We get to see Carl James speak to such a large audience. So please put your, give us a large welcome for Carl James.
Thank you, Lance. Yes, it is a rare opportunity. And thanks very much to Lance, to Vanessa, who encouraged this, and to Jeff, who insisted. And so it's quite a privilege to be here and to be able to talk to such a big audience. And of course, I'm hardly able to see because of the light. But thanks to William Waters for this opportunity. And I am interested in talking about culturally responsive and inclusive pedagogy and teaching. And I think Vanessa and Jeff, and probably Lance as well, have heard me ever so often comment on it, and other people in the audience, such as Lena and others who are here, talking about this, and probably they wanted me to engage in this conversation. So I am interested in this conversation. And so I provocatively titled my presentation, "The Limits to Culture." I choose to title the presentation that way because I wish for us to consider the ways in which we understand and take up culture in Canada, and the extent to which, in doing so, it serves to limit opportunities and possibilities for some members of society. And I want to think of how we take it up in the education in particular. Here are some questions I want us to consider. When we reference culture, what do we mean? What are the students, parents, and community groups that we think have culture, especially in the Canadian context? What is at stake if we do not give consideration to culture? And our practice of culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, moving us beyond culture as individual beliefs, values, norms, attitudes, and behavior to understand the structural realities? And is our use of culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy getting at the structural realities confronting racialized and marginalized students? And I think I build in a way on what Paul had been mentioning. Let me be clear though. Culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy can and does offer us a way of addressing students' achievement, their engagement in school, and our approach to teaching inclusively and equitably. But in our Canadian context, such an approach must, and I underline must, confront the ways in which state multicultural discourse inform our conceptualization of culture. In a recent Toronto Star article titled, "Should Toronto Schools speak one cultural language or many?" Louise Brown writes, "Culture-specific supports may help kids from communities with high dropout rates, Spanish speakers, she names, Somalis, or Aboriginal students, but some warn of slippery slope to segregation." And I think I reference this article because I think it gives us a sense of how we take up culture and we name certain kinds of people as having culture. And so the issues and concerns, it concerns me how we grapple with culture. It is specific that groups referenced by Brown are ones that are often seen as having culture. And a reading of Brown's article is that to understand and address the issues of immigrant, language, ethnic and racial minority group students, we must take into account culture. Who else then should we take into account when we take up culture? In our endeavor to work with students and parents and to make our classroom inclusive, equitable, and responsive to student needs and interests, culturally responsive pedagogy offers a useful theoretical frame. But what are its limitations in the Canadian context? I will return to this question later. But for now, let me give you a brief rundown of how we got here. In the 1970s, with increasing the number of students coming to Canadian school classroom, many of the dominant ethno-racial group grappled with the issue, teachers grappled with the issue of, or as they termed it at that time, problems of these new students. Many of them racial minorities, African and Caribbean origin, South Asians, and Asian background. It was at the time in the 70s that the multiculturalism policy also was introduced. It was introduced in 1971. And at that time, it enshrined the term cultural groups to refer to immigrants or ethnics. The policy started out by saying, there cannot be one cultural policy for Canadians of British and French origin, another for the original peoples, and yet another for all the others. Others referring to those other cultural groups. So state-sponsored multicultural policy has resulted in an overly simplistic understanding of culture as a set of practices brought from elsewhere by immigrants. A label that some cultural groups, quote, continue to carry even though they have been here in the country for generations. Within this context then, culture serves as a means of othering some Canadians, particularly those whose skin color serves as a signal that they're foreign. Culture then is something that others have and practice, regardless of their many years of living in Canada. In this way, state-sponsored multiculturalism imprisons our understanding of culture, having us think of it mainly as something that particular people and groups have, based primarily on race, ethnicity, language, religion, immigrant or refugee status. Interestingly, within this framework, many come to think of Canada as a country devoid of culture. Hence, we hear such question as, such statement as, there's no Canadian culture. And we're challenged to name, what is Canadian culture? According to the multiculturalism discourse then, individuals are able to maintain and practice their culture after living here for years. I relate all this to say that it's within this context that we must take seriously and think about how we take up culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, and the extent to which it is able to meet the expectations as a viable approach to addressing the diverse learning needs of students, as well as their disengagement, low achievement, and high dropout rates. My concern is, since Canada is perceived to not have a culture, and since immigrants have come into what tends to be considered a cultural vacuum, then a culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy as a means of addressing this students' need will be limited until culture is rescued from its multicultural moorings. Furthermore, since there is no Canadian culture, then institutions like schools similarly tend to perceive as if they've been without culture. Hence, it is thought that students are able to come into educational institutions with the idea that their culture and their related needs, interests, and aspirations will be accommodated. But is this so? Earlier, I posed a question: what are the limitations in the cultural approach in Canadian schooling context? Taking into account that it has been over 4 decades that students, parents, and communities have been advocating for educational programs that are responsive to students. A quick review of where we've come from. In the 1970s, we talked of multiculturalism. This was shortly after, and I think by 1975, after the Multiculturalism policy was introduced, school boards and provinces took up what was called multicultural education, and it was introduced differently in different provinces. So in provinces there were large immigrant population, as well as there were large number of Aboriginal people living in the urban context. There were multiculturalism programs in the 70s. By the 1980s, we talked of cross-culturalism and interculturalism, a way of thinking across cultures and then recognizing the interrelationality of cultures. In the 1970s, there was race relations and anti-racism education. It was around then that the boards of education established race relations offices and had race relations officers. And of course, Black History Month and such things became quite a good big event or a celebration in schools. And we had teachers doing anti-racism workshops, and teacher education at universities also were doing anti-racism work with teacher candidates. Some of you will remember that we even had an anti-racism secretariat in the province. And at that time as well, Ministry of Education asked school boards to also report how they're doing in the anti-racism world. Then I argued, while anti-racism as a framework was initiated as a means of addressing the structural and individual issues of racism, the hegemony of multicultural ethos conspired to hinder meaningful and needed changes in education. So our attempt these days to employ culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy is to get to the issues of students with which we have been grappling for decades. I will not go through some of the things that Lance has mentioned about culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, but suffice to say that it is that which we use to address some of the issues. And I wonder sometimes if it's another way of not naming race or racism to avoid the kinds of things that we as Canadians do not want to address. So if, in our multicultural, in Canadian context then, if CRRP is to be effective and meaningfully employed in Canadian schools, it must be inclusive and equitable for all students. And we must, first of all, recognize that it's in a Canadian context where the hegemonic discourse of multiculturalism operates as a barrier to the recognition of culture as a more structural factor and not referenced more in individual terms. Moreover, contrary to the static or fixed way in which culture is represented in our multicultural discourse, culture needs to be seen more importantly as a dynamic, relational, and complex set of values, beliefs, norms, patterns, and thinking in our society, and no one escapes the influence of culture. Immigrants here to me is the recognition that it's also important to me to see how demographic factors such as race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, disability, etc., are also integral to that which we consider culture. I say this because there are boards, there are programs, and there are, of course, educators who will be talking about culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, and who will say that they employ those things, but they're colorblind. or they want to employ it with a raceless idea. I wonder the extent to how we can think of culture as not informed by all these identity factors. I also think of some of the work that I've been doing, where I've been trying to ask schools, how are you dealing with some of the achievement of students? And boards are doing this work in relation to the achievement of students. Then I say, whose students are you that have these needs? How do you know that these particular students have these needs? And beyond the Toronto District School Board, who might be able to tell us about the Black students, the South Asian students, etc., most other students are not able to tell us, or the category of immigrant might be what's used to capture those. I'm talking here of the importance of data. And in the absence of data, how can you really be saying that you implement an effective and meaningful, culturally responsive and equitable policy in these boards? So to me then, we have to do more. We cannot be colorblind and say we're implementing culture. We have to think about culture in all its complexities. I value what Christine Sleater had to say in her article, Confronting the Marginalization of Culturally Responsive Pedagogy. She asserts, simplistic conceptions of culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy are due to cultural celebration, trivialization, essentializing culture, and substitute culture for political analysis of inequalities. This simplistic approach is one in which teachers rely on checklists and textbook activities without making the materials relevant to the students themselves. Culture is also often essentialized and thought through stereotypical characteristics of a group. This approach often negates the political critiques of white hegemony, which is an important factor that shapes students' social identities, whether they come from disenfranchised groups or not. In my own work, in my attempt to not reinscribe the individual way in which culture gets taken up and culture being attached to particular bodies, I've started to hopefully have the students with whom I work think about culture in a bigger context. And so I've been talking about community referenced approach to education. I'm thinking that if we're able to see how students who come to work with us come out of a community, and within that community, there's certain lessons that they learn, there's certain kinds of identities that they develop related to that community, then we can, and the complexity of that community, because we cannot think of the community as just static and homogeneous, but in terms of complex and constantly changing. Hopefully, when we're able to do that, we can be able to see that community and the cultural groups that these students try to represent in this school might be related to, one, the community, but more importantly, from the groups to which they belong. For when students witness the validation of their community in school and within the education process, and they accept the legitimacy of their presence within the school, then, more importantly, the cultural substance of their identities and their community will be seen as legitimate to them, and it will help to feed and sustain them. Teachers, therefore, must acknowledge and accept and validate these students' experiences, cultural identities, but more importantly, remove from the narrow individual way or the neoliberal way in which we are attempting to take up culture in the classrooms and in schools this way. As such, the curriculum, teaching, and indeed the entire school program cannot be just a classroom. It has to be the entire school program, must be inclusive of the diverse experiences of students, thereby making learning community-based and culturally relevant and responsive to the students we serve. Thank you very much.
And our final speaker will be Nicole West-Burns. Nicole West-Burns, PhD, is the Director of School Services with the Center for Urban Schooling at University of Toronto. Since 2008, Nicole has worked with the center supporting and guiding professional development to promote equitable educational experiences and outcomes in schools for all students, specifically utilizing culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy. Based on her work with the center, Nicole served as lead writer on the text, The Equity Continuum. It's a bestseller. And after the colon, it goes, Action for Critical Transformation in Schools and Classrooms. Please join me in welcoming Nicole West-Burns.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Waters. This has been a wonderful opportunity for all of us to come together every year to have this symposium, and your support has meant so much, so thank you. All the students, or most of the students, have gone. They were incredible, but I wanted to acknowledge them. Okay, so I have a clicker. If you'll notice, my outfit coordinates with my PowerPoint. I know the color's not quite right on the screen, so here we go. So tonight, it is night by now. Yeah, we've been here a long time. Tonight, I want to share with you some of the general overviews of what culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy has really come to mean for us based on the work that we've done the past 6 years at the Center for Urban Schooling. And I've been part of a fabulous team that I would really be remiss if I didn't mention. So my sidekicks, and I won't say partners in crime, Karen used that term earlier, but I'll say partners in hardcore equity work. Jeff Kugler, Karen Murray when she was here, and still, now that she's back at TDSB, we're still like this. and Vanessa Russell. So it's been a wonderful opportunity. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is some of the work that we've done collectively, collaboratively over the past few years. But I want you to know too that I started reading about culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, and I should actually separate them because we're the ones that put them together. So I started reading about culturally responsive teaching and culturally relevant teaching and pedagogy about 20 years ago. I know I'm dating myself a little bit, when I started doing my own doctoral work. And what I was really looking for in that work was successful environments for education for African American youth. And when I was doing that research, there's so much that was out there, and still is, that comes from the perspective that Paul talked about, that deficit perspective. But culturally responsive teaching and culturally relevant teaching and pedagogy was put forward as something where teachers had found success. And so that's how I came into this work 20 years ago. And I've been learning continuously along the way. And I think we've done some pretty neat things in how we've shaped it within the Canadian context in the last few years. So I'm going to share some of that with you. I'm also going to share with you some of the things that we've tried to do in our professional learning communities and professional development to support educators really developing what we're going to call a lens for this work, because I agree, it is not a set of discrete practices. It is not a set of lesson plans. It is an ideology. I think that was mentioned as well, where you come in and this is how you think about your teaching, and then you think about your practice, and you think about the families and the communities and the students you serve, and then you act in certain ways. And that's really what makes the core of this so important. I'm also going to share with you some of the pieces. I want to really be clear about this. I don't want to say some of the products that have resulted from culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, but some of the pieces that teachers and students, and we got to hear some of those tonight, are creating as they're doing this work. Because in this work, educators are thinking, and they're thinking about themselves, and they're thinking about their practice, and they're learning about their learners. And so we always say we're on a journey, and it really is true. We've never gotten there. We're always continuously learning and growing and working with the learners who come in our classrooms every day. So some of the products I'm going to share are about specific projects that we've engaged in, and it's not the end. It's end with the little e, because this is what they've produced, but we know that we're still continuing on in this journey. And lastly, I'm going to provide to you what I think are some critical things to think about as we try to move forward. So I also want to say that culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, I'm always really clear about this, is one spoke under the umbrella of equity education. There are other approaches. I never want to claim anything is the answer, but I certainly think it provides possibilities. And I think it's intended from its theoretical base specifically to respond to the needs of historically marginalized and racialized students. And that has been the focus of the center, the focus of our work, focus that's the core of my being and my heart. And so this is in part why we have applied it, because we certainly need to be cognizant of that and be intentional in our work in the Toronto District School Board, in the GTA, in all the school boards in which we're working. So I'm going to start with a short video clip that actually I went into YouTube for inspiration. And actually I want to mention as well that this tonight, this program is actually going to be on something called OISE Tube. I just found out about it. Does anyone know about OISE Tube? There's an OISE Tube. It's like our own YouTube. But anyway, this will be shown there later. Shortly, I was told, in a few weeks maybe. And so I went on YouTube for inspiration, and I said, I'm going to get something that's really going to help us enter this conversation of culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy and be excited about it. Maybe you can't see that. And I certainly did not download the video, because actually when I went on, I found a lot of talking heads, but I said, that's what I'm going to be tonight, so I'm not going to get a video of someone else talking about this. That's what I'm going to do. But I also found a lot of things that were really, really problematic. And so this is actually, you can't really see it too well, but there's a young black man and there's a white teacher, and if I were to play it, they would be doing the Dougie. And it says culturally relevant pedagogy. Now, I did bring it here for a reason. When I worked with the Office of Early Literacy at the State Department of Education in the state of New Jersey, we would run PD sessions for teachers around best practices in literacy instruction. And we had one of our vocabulary gurus who we paid a lot of money to who came in to talk about the power of using opposites in vocabulary instruction. Do you know where I'm going with this? So I said, you know what, I'm going to use this horrifically offensive screenshot because I will not add to the almost 3,000 hits that this has gotten. And I'm going to talk about what culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy is and use this as an example of what it is not. So with that in my mind, the Dougie. And maybe somewhere we chuckle a little bit about that, but it really is so problematic because unfortunately, this to me is emblematic of sometimes how this work gets taken up. A teacher learning how to do a dance that's popular among the youth in her classroom. And that's not a problem in and of itself, maybe, but it is problematic when it becomes a defining component of what this work is and can do. So those of you that know some of the components, I'll go over them very quickly in a few minutes. Where is the high academic expectation? Where's the cultural competence that builds and affirms outside of a stereotypical reference point? Where is the critique of the system of power within which they operate, where they're able to Dougie, but not push to further develop their intellectual capabilities or even critically examine the schooling power structures that have more students who look like this young man sitting in special education, non-gifted exceptionality classes, and more locally developed and more applied classes than academic ones. So what happens when with this political pedagogy, because it is a political pedagogy, what happens is that we sometimes take it up and we make it palatable. We take it and we make it fit. We take it and we make it fit into our comfort zone. We take it and we make it fit within a box of what we believe about the students in our schools. We learn a dance, we play popular music, or we engage in craft making that is also maybe appropriating, or we say that we are doing CRRP because we do a lesson or even a set of lessons that has culturally relevant or culturally responsive as the title, created by someone else outside of any knowledge of the students who sit in front of us in the classroom, and it possibly doesn't require us as educators to challenge anything. We allow folks to bring in food and dress in their ethnic clothes, and we like the clothes and we love the food. But how do we push ourselves to really engage in a way that really does make a difference for the daily schooling experiences and outcomes of our learners that challenges power and privilege? That is what CRRP is supposed to do. It is an approach to teaching, it is a lens, it is political. It is not doing the Dougie. I was so angry about this, actually, that I searched for further things to anger me on the internet. And then I found someone who was equally as angry. A brother named Brian Foster, who writes a blog called Still Furious and Brave. He said, and quote, he saw this heinous video too. Heinous. Quote, "The problem isn't that teachers want to do the Dougie with their students." Okay, for me that's questionable. "It is that they are rocking and jigging in the same power structure that will lead those students down markedly different paths." So with that, that is what CRRP isn't. Moving forward. So at the center, when we literally sat in a room a few years back, and I remember Lance was on the responsive side, I had really dug deep in Gloria Ladson-Billings' work in Culturally Relevant, and it was literally Jeff, Lance, Dominique, and myself, and we sat in the room and we debated about culturally responsive, culturally relevant, and we decided, you know what, for our work, we're going to pull the two theories together. The two bodies of work, we're going to pull those together. In our minds, they were not oppositional, but they supported and reinforced each other, albeit they were different. They both came from work that said we must explore what we do as educators, what we do as systems, and how we look at how we connect to who is in our classrooms and schools. As opposed to saying something is wrong and lacking and taking deficit approaches, this work asks us to explore ourselves. What don't we know, and what do we need to do? And how do we think, and therefore then how do we act? So we pulled in some components of the responsive, mostly from Geneva Gay, but also some of Jackie Irvine's stuff, and others who had something to say about this body of knowledge. And so these are some of the highlights of culturally responsive. Now, you know I could spend a whole hour talking about this theory, but we're going to go on because my colleagues said you cannot do that tonight, Nicole. But I want to be clear to say that when we talk about incorporating students' culture, and we're going to come back to culture and how we've come to define it in our work here, we really are talking about a non-reductive, non-stereotypical, non-monolithic, cardboard cutout kind of way. So then we move on to one of my sheroes, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who wrote the book, The Dream Keepers. And basically, she wrote this book in response to so much literature, still out there, I was going to say 20 years ago, still out there, about the deficits, about those things we just talked about what students are lacking. And what she said was, you know what? There's nothing short of a racist ideology that says black students can't learn. So guess what? I know they can learn, and I'm going to talk to teachers who work with students who've been deemed successful to find out what it is they're thinking, and then because of what they're thinking, what it is they're doing, and how they interact with community, and how they learn, and all of those things. And I'm going to learn what they do. And so what they do comes in those three big categories. And if you haven't read the book, read the book, because I'm not doing it justice in this 15-minute time frame, even though I may go over a moment. And so what we did was we took those three big categories that she found in her teaching, and then we looked at other research that had come about. In 2008, Morrison, Robbins, and Rose wrote an article about how are teachers taking this up in classrooms? How are they operationalizing this work? That was the title of their article. And so very briefly, I'll share with you, high expectations has come to mean, you know, we all say all students can learn. It's written on billboards, it's written on bulletin boards, and it's all across schools. But how do we really think about all learners? And do we model and scaffold and differentiate based on knowing our students? And do we take personal responsibility for their success? Those are some of the aspects of having those high expectations. If we think about that area of cultural competence, here's where I want to broaden it. In the work that we've started to do at the center, we said, you know what, culture has to be more inclusive. It has to be inclusive of multiple aspects of identity. So although race and ethnicity are extremely important, and no one is saying we don't need to talk about race, we're saying we do need to talk about race, but we cannot talk about race in cardboard cutout ways. We cannot talk about ethnicity in unidimensional ways. We have to understand that there are complexities to identity. We have to think about intersectionality of social identities and non-monolithic approaches to identity, and that's what we've tried to incorporate. And so this component is really, really powerful for me because I always think back to black activists from the 60s in the States, Dick Gregory, and he said, I never knew shame until I went to school. And that's a powerful statement. So when we think about cultural competence, we want all of our learners, when they walk in the door, and based on who they come from, where they live, who they love, what language they speak, how they dress, what they have or don't have, they will never feel shame. So that's what the cultural competence piece is about. How do we build up our learners? How do we provide them with opportunities to share themselves, affirm who they are, both as individuals and as part of larger social groups and social identities? It's a critical piece. But that means in the classroom, sometimes we got to step back and we've got to make space and we've got to say what we don't know. And so we have to find ways to find out about our students in authentic ways, conversations about academics and about what happens outside of school. Allow them to bring their lives into the classroom in real ways, meaningful ways in the curriculum. Engage in home visits, spend time in communities. Connect to interests, honor home language with opportunities for students to use the language that they came into this world with, and then find ways to translate that learning. That's just some of cultural competence. In terms of critical consciousness, as my friend Karen said earlier, critical consciousness is the one that we take up the least according to the literature because it's the hardest. This is the pushback. This is where we say, yes, racism exists, and what do we need to know about that, and what do we need to understand, and how do we fight it? And this is the one that involves the social justice work. This is the one that involves sometimes critical literacy, but this is always in our mind the one that says there are issues of power and privilege and oppression in this world, and we have to acknowledge that, and we engage in active teaching about how that plays out in the students' lives. So those are the big components that I could have taken 2 hours to talk about, but I'm not allowed. And I want to say too, what we're talking about in terms of some of those actions are not antithetical to what teacher effectiveness research says we should be doing. How do we know our students, and how do we bring their lives into the classrooms? So again, this could be another 2-hour slide, but it won't. Because I think what's really important though, and I wanted to include it, even though I'm not allowed to talk about those components, I wanted to include it because, as I said before, you notice the rainbow glasses? The lens that we have, the lens is really important. I'm not going to take a lot of those actions on those other pages if I don't possess that lens, right? So Villegas and Lucas wrote a book about, so how do we get teachers to that place? Got to check that one out too. So what have we tried to do in terms of CRRP within this context? Well, what we've tried to say is that culture is big, not culture with the little c as one aspect of my social identity, but culture as being broad-based, and that everyone does have culture, and that people, and that culture is a composite of all these different pieces of who I am and the intersectionality of the different identities that I bring into the space. We also have tried to say, you know what, not good enough to do it in one space, in one classroom. So this notion of the whole school approach, we said, you know, these theories were initially based upon individual teachers acting in individual ways in individual classrooms. It's got to be bigger than that if we really want to talk about school change, because I don't want it to be good and safe and meaningful and loving and supportive in this classroom, and you walk out in the hall and get called a name. Or your parents come into the school and feel like, wow, I love to quote Jim Cummins when he says, this place is for English speakers only. So how do we do this work across entire schools? So actually, this is a photo that was taken from an article that we shared in some of the work that we are doing with educators in the field, where we wanted to talk about different profiles of teachers trying to do this work. And I think, and I just want to give credit to this, I always like to make sure I cite people's work for who they are. This came from a text called Breaking the Silence, Recognizing the Social and Cultural Resources Students Bring to the Classroom, and it's edited by Catherine Compton-Lilly. And so in our PD work, I think it's really important that we talk about this. We try to always put in 3 components, that there be identity work about who I am as the educator. So I look at my own self, my power, my privilege, all of that. That we connect it to theory. Theory is important. It helps place us, it helps push us, and it helps ground the things we're finding. And the practical application. So when the rubber meets the road, what does that mean when I go in the classroom and this happens? What does that mean when we want to do this in school and this happens? So we always try to take it to that place of practice. So we engage in readings about the work, we look at issues of identity and privilege and how they operate within systems of oppression, we look at identities and intersectionality, we push the conversations tied to our own deficit beliefs, stereotypes, and prejudices because we all have them. As Beverly Daniel Tatum says in her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and other conversations about race, when we live in a society with smog, we cannot help but breathe it in. We all have them. So it's really important that we make sure that we create a space where we can have those conversations. And sometimes that talk is uncomfortable, but it is an important part of the work. And we try to make it accessible for teachers by engaging in their interests as well, in their inquiry in the areas where they want to go. We don't pretend that it's easy or that the lessons outside of any specific ideology is going to do anything to move it forward. So as we engage in the work, I'm going to share with you 2 projects that we've had the privilege and honor of working with some really great educators on over the past several years. We usually start, or most recently start, from these 7 areas that are part of the equity continuum, the text we talked about. So I'm going to share with you some of the work. From 2009 to 2013, we engaged in a 4-year project funded primarily by the Paloma Foundation with additional funding and in-kind support from former TDSB Director Chris Spence, various administrators and teachers within the Model Schools for Inner Cities, and the Ruth and Alexander Dworkin Tolerance Fund. We worked with teachers in the field, some acting as host or associate teachers, and teacher candidates. We brought people together for half-day seminars across the year to deepen their understandings and practices related to this work. And here are some photos that represent the work of these educators that year. This first one is actually a photo of a teacher's work and students' work from a 1st grade classroom. And they were looking at, do I see me in their classroom libraries? And they responded to 1st grade friendly surveys about whether they see themselves, whether they see families that look like theirs, whether they see families with different structures, whether they see people who hold the same jobs as people in their community, whether they see people that actually are, yeah, I think there's people in wheelchairs or people with physical challenges. So they were asked a bunch of different questions. They engaged in the work. They did some numeracy around graphing, and then they wrote letters about the kind of books that they wanted to see. In this classroom, second grade students were learning about the issues at Attawapiskat and taking a stand. This letter starts, "Dear Prime Minister, what you need to do." Another focus on identity in a first and second grade class where the students were asked to talk about parts of them that they love. And this is where this little girl, she loves her skin because it's brown, her eyes because they're oval, her shirt because it's red and pink, and her hijab because it has sparkle. Love it. This was a seventh grade class where they were looking at gender in the media and how are gender roles established in the media, how are they put forth in the media, and then they did some investigation in their own schools and talked about ways they can push back to the gender stereotyping that goes on. This is actually a mural that's at one of the schools that we worked with, Georgetown Public School, or Georgetown Community School, I should say, I'm sorry, Georgetown Community School. And this wasn't part of the project, but it actually is symbolic of the kind of work we were doing. And this mural actually, the students obviously were a part of making, and then at the bottom they wrote about the things they like in their communities. How many of our communities get a bad rap in the media? How many of our communities do the kids not get to hear anything good about or not get to share the good things? And so this was an activity that brought that out. And this was another activity where we took the idea and we had some professional reading around, it's from Catherine Compton-Lilly's other book, her first one I think it was, where she talked about, it's called Confronting Racism, Poverty, and Power, and she shares a lot of stories from her teacher research work. And this was actually from an article where she talked about a teacher who took a camera home, or who gave a camera to students to take home, a disposable camera, and to take pictures of the jobs that their family members hold. And so that we could find a way to talk about those jobs that are very important. Even if someone's not working outside of the home, someone's caring for you, someone's feeding you, someone's providing for you. And so we don't have to talk about community helpers in the way that the textbooks or the posters say. Oh, I know I have 0 minutes. What's that about? In another project, I'll be brief, this one is funded by the Inclusive Education branch of the Ministry of Education, and we've really had a privilege to work with some great educators again in this project. So a shout out to Halton District School Board Irma Colson and Toronto District School Board William Burgess. And in this project, again, educators were pushed to come up with an inquiry that was power aware and an inquiry that recognized the systems of oppression. And so here's just some samples of this work. And some of them are here. Ooh, hey. Ah. So there's some work going on around equity and equality and explaining it to students. What is that and how does it play out? And here's some 7th graders figuring out, is our school doing that? There's some work around voice and student voice in kindergarten classrooms, and what does that mean when I get to have my voice heard in a kindergarten classroom? Catherine? A lot of work around identity, and I think it's so great because we're looking at issues of identity, who I am, inside, who I feel I am, because we can't always see all parts of identity, right? And even when complexion doesn't match, racial ethnic identity, like all those kinds of things, the complexities of it, it's the inside and the outside, and a lot of work going on, and your connections to different social identity groupings. Kids drawing themselves, what they're wanting to share, what they look like, who loves them and who they love, what their faith is, best part of me. And what you see on the outside with my mask, Jeanette, the artist who helped make those masks with Karen's project as well, what you see on the outside and then what's inside of me. So in my closing, I just want to leave you with this. In my spin class that I go to sometimes, not very often, but I try, the instructor says, better, stronger, faster, harder. Better, stronger, faster, harder. It's her mantra throughout the class to get us going. And so I started to think, okay, wow, so CRRP, better, stronger, faster, harder. And I was talking to my girls, Vanessa and Karen, the other day, and they said, well, you know, Nick, sometimes better, stronger, but maybe not faster, harder. Like with this work, maybe sometimes we need to slow down, see what we don't know, right? And maybe we need to read the room, as Karen says all the time, and sometimes we don't push so hard right here, right now, but we nuance it and figure out ways to enter, because this stuff is tough work. So I always say better, though, because I think we can always be better, we can always grow, we can always learn. So I'll just leave you with the few pointers that I want to make. The first one actually comes from an article on physician training, and I think that as we do this work better, we have to have what they call cultural humility. So when a doctor goes into a community to work with patients who've been underserved, so we have to walk into schools and community settings that we don't know, and we have to go in and be open. We have to be ready to learn, be willing to accept that we know very little, and see learning as a requirement for what we are there to do. We have to learn from the students, the community, read papers from the community, talk to people, be open to the fact that we alone don't have the answers. In the next one, on respect for boundaries, when we engage in activities around lived experiences and identity and all of this, we have to create spaces for students to be able to share and at the same time respect boundaries. Deborah Appelman, one of Lance's former props and a wonderful intellectual, came here a few weeks ago to speak, and she talks a lot about teacher identity and representation and our relationships with students. And she spoke here recently and warned us of mining students for curriculum. We need to understand that when we ask students to share, that we must do it thoughtfully and carefully and cautiously, and be ready to support them when needed. It is very easy for one to engage in identity work when those identities have been privileged in one way or another in larger world. There is less of a risk, and we must be mindful that this is an area of vulnerability for students. It doesn't mean we don't ask students to share. We do it, but we do it thoughtfully. And also for many for whom the schooling system has been not the best place, we have to recognize that there may be a lack of trust. And so the onus is on us to build trust so that valuable sharing can happen, so that those connections, that social interaction, those bridges to learning can be made. And we as educators also have to make ourselves vulnerable and be open to the sharing ourselves. The third one, be brave and expand the equity conversation. This actually connects to one of our young artists who spoke up here earlier, and he was talking about Pink Day. And I think what's really important this spring, Rethinking Our Schools has an editorial where the title is actually called Queering Our Schools. And so when I say be brave about this, let's not talk about bullying as bullying, because bullying is really more than that. They say in the article, bullying is a broad term that degenders, deraces, de-everything school safety. So we need to be brave and push those conversations so that we don't gloss over fundamental issues that create safe and unsafe spaces for kids in schools every day. Bullying is often tied to homophobia, transphobia, sexism, racism, Islamophobia. These are critical issues that we can't gloss over, and they underlie what's going on behind bullying. We have to be brave and push the critical consciousness, the tough stuff, the conversations we don't want to have. We need to do it because we need to create a space for the counter-narrative, the perspectives we don't hear, the identities that usually get left out. And last but not least, I want to say that we have to continue to push for systems to change. We have to bring in more people who are representative of the world's diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, language, disability, gender identity, and religion. How do we create more opportunities for students to see their possible selves, as Ron Ferguson from the Achievement Gap Institute at Harvard talks about, within people who come into their schools and classrooms daily? And it is not as simple as matching something, this aspect of my identity with someone. But what is the power in matching skin color and hair texture? Or what is the power in knowing that if I have two moms at home, that my lesbian teacher talks about her family as well? Or what is the power in knowing that my teacher is in a wheelchair and there's someone in my home who uses a wheelchair, or I'm in a wheelchair? Or the power of an indigenous teacher who cleanses the room with a water ceremony and opens the day in her language, new channels? Or a teacher who wears a hijab? What is the power in that? It isn't as simple as that, and it is. And it is also the lived experiences, diverse perspectives, divergent insights based on positionality. It's the ways of being and knowing that we each bring into a space that cannot be replicated by anyone else, no matter how much we engage in culturally responsive and relevant frameworks. This diversity is also crucial. And last but not least, and what are we going to do? It doesn't say accountability intentionally, it's not a typo. It says I-countability, because it comes down to what is each of us going to do. Vanessa and I ran a group called Queer Space Chat to create a safe space for queer teacher candidates here at OISE to talk about their experiences. And last week we had a panel where 4 educators came in and talked about, and these are all educators who are open in their teaching spaces, and they talked about how wonderfully supportive and respected they were from their students of a variety of races, ethnicities, religions. And then They talked about some of the heinous things that have been said and done to them by administrators and colleagues that they worked with. We cannot expect to create this equity work in these equity spaces and all of that in our schools with our students if we're not embodying those principles and acting in those ways ourselves. So the last question is, what are we prepared to do? What do we have the will to do? I'm going to close right now with a clip from a video that actually comes from Indiana. I'm not going to close with that clip and that video that actually comes from Indiana Wesleyan University. But I just want to say that it is the opposite of the doing the Dougie. And it really asks us some critical questions about what we see when we look at students and how we question what we do every day. So thank you.
Okay, I want to invite all of the presenters up to the table, please. We have about 30 minutes. You've been really patient, so some of you are leaving. If you need to take a little stretch, that's fine. My thought is we'll have about 10 minutes of conversation at the table, and then we will have 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience, okay? Okay, so first thing, this is, oh, okay. This first part is going to be a bit more informal, and I just want to ask all the panelists, after hearing each one of you speak, if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share or questions that you'd like to share around the table here. I also have something, but I'm giving the panelists. I think that person just came on. Thoughts? Pearl, Paul, Jillian, Nicole.
Well, actually, I'm going to add one thing. Look, I'm getting my 2 minutes now. I got a lot to say. No, but I do want to go back to Jillian's data, and this is important because there has been some work around what has been the impact of teacher training in culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy or teaching, and how that plays out then in terms of special education referrals. So there's an academic named Deborah Volz who's written an article about how when teachers, and this is her particular research, but when they engaged in training around culturally, and I believe specifically in that one she named it as culturally relevant, but when they engaged in training around culturally relevant teaching and pedagogy, that these teachers then, they were less likely to make referrals immediately. They were more likely to look at what do I know or not know about the students. They were more likely to question, did they differentiate? Did they scaffold instruction? They were more likely to look at what materials or tools or things like that did I utilize? Do I know everything I need to know? Is something going on outside of school for the students? So they were more likely not to say, as Paul talked about too, deficit, something wrong, but more likely to engage in an exploration of what they did, what they know, and what they can do. So they're definitely, I mean, again, that's just one study that I know of, but I think it really does, in the ways in which we do it, if we do it deeply, not doing a Dougie, but if we do it deeply and work on the tough conversations, I think it really does force us as educators to really put on that lens to think about all of those things to help us make better decisions for the students.
Okay, I have just a comment related to Jillian's data and the whole issue of accountability. In my experience, one of the reasons why a school district or a particular school would want to engage in a conversation or have a PD session around culture responsive and relevant pedagogy or other equity approaches or anti-racism is because of a race or class achievement gap or some sort of gap in outcomes, right? So the idea is that through sort of implementing some sort of pedagogical strategy or intervention that we're going to sort of quote unquote close the gap. But in fact, Julian was really the only one who spoke specifically about outcomes. And often when we talk about implementing certain kinds of culture responsive and relevant pedagogy, there's a hesitancy of focusing on the actual academic outcomes. And we also know that in other districts and in the United States in particular, now they're tying sort of a lot of professional development to academic outcomes. They're saying your teacher, your promotion should be tied to how well students do on particular standardized tests. So my question to all of you is, how are you sort of navigating the focus on academic outcomes in relation to sort of interventions and reforms or culture responsive and relevant pedagogy? Should we be focusing on that? Is that sort of actually something that's getting in the way of us recognizing or realizing a more just society? How do you navigate the sort of pendulum of outcomes versus process?
I'll just offer a few thoughts on that. I think the issue is how we measure what we're using to measure outcomes. And I know, a big problem in the U.S. and increasingly elsewhere as well is, it's being measured purely by standardized test scores. Now, I can be a gay student and do well on those tests. That doesn't mean I've experienced school as an equitable learning environment. So that's part of it. But also, the tests are starting to drive the conversation about equity. So I was at an international conference about educational equity, and I noticed the keynote speakers at this particular conference kept talking about test scores, raising test scores, raising test scores. So the whole conversation about equity was revolved around test scores. And part of the problem for me is that the testing mechanism itself is a sign of the corporatization of public schools. So the people benefiting the most from these tests is really Pearson in the US, or these corporations, and they're driving the school reform, and we can't allow them to drive the conversation about equity, because that's the problem. That's part of the problem that needs to be solved. So I think, talking about outcomes in terms of finishing school, as long as we can talk about that complexity too, is it a dropout or is it a push out, that kind of thing. I do think it's important to talk about outcomes, but I think we have to talk about outcomes broadly and not the way that corporate profiteers want us to talk about outcomes.
As well. Right, as Paul was saying, if we acknowledge that the measurements are flawed, then looking at outcomes specifically to measure equity is also going to be flawed. One thing that we are looking at on the board is a measure that we've dubbed the measurement of belonging, that looks at students' experience of safety and acceptance in school, as well as shared power within schools. That's something that we're hoping will complement some of this outcome-driven discussions around equity.
I think of outcome in a culturally responsive and relevant way. And what would we have to do to change? For example, I think here of how much the tests, how we use tests and the EQA and all those other tests to measure the extent to which students are doing good in particular areas. For example, we use the same test for the Afrocentric school and measure those students there against students in other kinds of schools. And I wonder the extent to which, if we really were doing culturally responsive pedagogy, it is true that those students should be able to do well, but should we also provide different kinds of tests and different kinds of measures that will be relevant to those students? We might want to think how we might have to change the structure, the way in which we provide these kinds of measures of outcomes.
Other thoughts that you want to ask each other? Okay. I think let's...
Just on the whole outcome there, I just have to have this one thing. And I think there's an important statement, and I don't know exactly what those pieces are, and appreciate all the conversation my colleagues have said. And I go back to a quote that we had a principal here from the Social Justice High School in Chicago, and he said several years ago, when our students graduate, we want them to be prepared to do whatever it is they want to do. And I think that's what the outcome is that I'm going for. So I don't know if that's from a test score. Clearly they have to be literate and numerate. We cannot pretend that a part of this work is not making sure we have high academic standards at the same time. And we have to see them as intellectual. We have to see them as capable. If we go in with the deficit view that we've talked about, we are never going to raise that standard for them to get there, for them to make whatever choice it is they want to make when they finish school. That's all I'm saying.
I just want to add one thing to that, because I think that's a really super important point. I think part of the issue is that if we do measure and we find these gaps in things like literacy, the response often is to blame the schools or to blame the teachers for that, when the issue there often is poverty and racism and that sort of thing. So if the state is going to require these measurements but not respond to what the underlying issues are and the gaps, I think that's problematic, and I think it's also problematic that teachers often end up getting blamed basically for the symptoms of problems they have no control over, which are problems of wealth inequality, problems of income inequality, and that sort of thing.
Okay, I think let's move to questions from the audience. So Jeff, and there are one mic. If you have a question, some people like this, some people don't. If you are able to please make your way to the mic. If you are not able but want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And somebody, Jeff or Vanessa, will put that person in the queue. But please make your way, if you are able, to the mic.
And if people, just because we have so little time, if people could really be brief in terms of getting to the question.
Let's take a couple first. Okay, thank you.
Greetings, and thank you for all the combined research, thinking, quoting, and processing that you've all done tonight. I think what stands out for me is acknowledging how do we have a system, how do we approach a system of learning that appeals to different learning styles. I happen to be an Indigenous arts educator, and I'm aware there's introverts, there's extroverts. I overwhelm some folks because I come out the gate running, and I know I have to slow it down for the introverts. And how do we assess people's interests based on those learning styles, but also how do we work within a system that doesn't play to the strengths of our teacher? If we've got teachers who are really good with preteens, but now we're assigning them to a kindergarten class because of an education system all total that doesn't even listen to the strengths or tune into the strengths of the teachers, how do we appeal to the learning styles of the learners, but how do we appeal to the strengths of our educators so that we have a quality of education that brings out the best in everybody in our system?
Thank you. Let's take one more question and then...
Okay. Hi, Dr. James. I'm curious about informal learning spaces. So if we're talking about systemic change, I want the panel to consider outside of the regular school districts and the role community-based learning has in this struggle.
So we have one question about how do we create sort of an education system that plays to the strengths of teachers. And we have another question about how do sort of non-formal or informal learning spaces, community-based learning outside of school, figure into the way you're conceptualizing culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy or equity and social justice in schools.
I'll just say about the learning styles, really, the first part of the question, I think, was about learning styles. And I thought that it's an interesting point. I think part of the challenge with learning styles is that it's become such an industry that it has been sort of abused. And the first way it's been abused is the conversations about identity-specific learning styles, which are completely bogus. The preferred learning styles within any one identity group is just as diverse as the preferred learning styles across any two identity groups. So the notion that there's the woman learning style and the man learning style and the different racial learning styles, completely bogus. Also, the notion that people have consistent learning styles is bogus. It depends entirely on what someone's teaching, the context in which they're teaching, whether they feel welcomed in the context in which they're teaching. But having said that, again, I think ultimately what I think we need a global teacher movement that rejects the deprofessionalization of teachers, that takes the notion of what teachers are or supposed to be out of the hands of people who do it every day and put it into the hands of bureaucrats and increasingly put it into the hands of corporate profiteers. Because, I think that is part of the problem there, with especially also with teachers being assigned to do things they know aren't good for the students that they teach.
When I think of learning styles, I also think of how to do teaching and how to set up classroom differently. I also wonder, what would it take for teachers to go into the classroom one day and say, okay, class, we're going to construct our curriculum together. Are we going to construct what we want to know over the next month or 2 months together and share those ideas and probably at the end of it, even test ourselves on how much we've learned? I'm not sure that the school system, and I keep it, many of the questions that we keep getting, most of the time we're going to come back to the extent to which the system that we have, the system we have inherited as an education system, is able to accommodate the kinds of work that we should do and we must do if we're going to be moving towards an equitable and just education system for all students. So therefore, it would need a whole community movement, teacher movement, in order to address all the questions we're asking, particularly the learning styles. And therefore, the place that learning styles, both in terms of teaching style and learning style, are supposed to be complementary. We can't have one without the other. And the other point that I would add to the whole learning style is that students learn with particular kind, one can have a teacher in one subject and not like the teacher in that subject, and have that same teacher in another subject and like the teacher because of that subject, or because the subject enables a kind of learning style that the student like that. So it's always fluid. So again, we cannot constantly think of, we can come up with the 10 best ways of always doing this, but constantly be reflective on what does this situation enables me to do. And therefore, that's why sometimes it's so useful to constantly understand what framework are we using today in this learning situation. What am I bringing to this learning situation? And of course, as we think about these, we cannot leave ourselves as persons because if I go into a classroom, I want to learn too, even though I'm going to be a teacher. And therefore, I would want the students to know, listen, this is also my learning style, and this is also some of the things I want to be able to know from you in this course. So the more we teach students the idea that you can also teach, just as you're learning, then we probably engage very fully these students. And sometimes the idea of successful, and of course, we might get away with, we might not have to talk about classroom management after that, because students are constantly engaged, because what they're doing is what they have committed themselves to. And that's why I like the second question with regard to community learning, because probably it's in the community that the shackles that we get in schools are probably removed, and we can experiment as much as possible with what learning that might be best able to take place in those communities. Therefore, I think that we need to build a relationship between those community kind of learning and teaching and opportunities that students might be exposed to, and relate them to schools, and probably bring them to school in order to be able to be more effective and responsive to students' needs and aspirations.
Well, I'm just taking off of that, Carl, another theme or thread that I listened to running through your different talks is there's a tension between identifying or linking culture to communities and groups and linking them to identities. So some of you spoke about culture of recognizing the sort of the diverse social identities of our students, meaning their race, class, gender. Some of you spoke about linking culture to particular communities and groups. And I think this is a crucial or important sort of mode for thinking about pedagogy. This was also, incidentally, one of the differences. We took a delegation of people from TDSB and from OISE to Montreal to think about the ways that they viewed culture and linked culture to teaching. And what was one of the interesting things is in Toronto we talked a lot about identity and social identities and culture. But in Montreal they talked a lot about language, particular institutions, particular histories. So I just noticed that difference, and that seemingly has a lot to do with if that lens of culture as identity versus culture as community of what we do for our pedagogy. Maybe they're not separate.
I don't think they're separate, but I'm thinking here, when we talk about, when we're talking here about culture, sometimes it's as if we can also name culture at times, but sometimes it's just there. It's just what we are caught up in. And it's not so obvious to be able to name sometimes. And that's why sometimes in this whole discussion of culture, we need to think that it's sometimes things that are not said that we're consumed by, which are also discovered.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple of questions here.
Yeah, well, I actually just want to share some stuff that's been going on in my school. I'm a teacher. I'm a grade 1 French immersion teacher, but I'm also an equity position of responsibility, which the staff voted to have. So for the last 3 years, I've been trying to, do it on a kind of school level, like a school-wide level. And my best allies are those teachers who went through this urban education program. Because a couple of years ago, I had a little coffee conversation, invited TDSB equity instructional leader to come out. Only 2 teachers showed up, right? So it was a little depressing. But finally we got some support from admin. We haven't really been talking about admin here because that's a really crucial piece. So all teachers can do what they want in their classrooms, but you have to have some support from admin. So finally we got some support from admin, and the snowball got rolling. And the best thing for me was the most recent assembly, the Day of Pink assembly. And it was those urban education graduates that well, we have these assemblies, but it's more like a sort of sharing. Yeah, I know. Well, I'm just saying that these assemblies were spaces where the kids were voicing what they had learned through, safe spaces, their responses to global gay marriage, where it was punishable by law or legal, and all the kids in the school were just spellbound, listening to the responses of these junior kids and their thought process that had gone on in the classroom. And also, it was a good modeling for those teachers that are not quite sure about CRRP to see it modeled, how they were doing it in the classroom. So it was like a big PD session. So I'm just sharing and saying thanks, but also the piece about admin. Admin is really important, because I know admin that say, oh, I don't like this touchy-feely stuff. Well, what am I supposed to do? You can do pockets in your, in your classroom, but unless you have support of admin, it is kind of difficult to do it on a school-wide basis. So.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to take a couple more in the interest of time, but we know we have a question about admin and support. Thank you for sharing.
Even the last three.
Yes.
Thank you, Lance, and thanks to the distinguished panel for all your work. And I wish you all the best. My question is very simple. How do you address resistance by school boards towards CRRP in light of the Ministry of Education's Equity and Inclusive Education strategy?
Okay.
Just to complement Kirk's question, the additional challenge as we try to move CRRP forward in the best way that we can figure out how to do in our spaces, in our places, recognizing that there are countervailing forces in the system, where the system is being flooded by resources, free resources from the Fraser Institute, from the CCCE, other corporate interests around individualizing the challenge and teaching a very different story about individual responsibility.
Okay, thank you.
Just wanted to pick up on one of the things that Lance was asking about in terms of this work being too closely tied with stuff like EQAO results and the danger in that. And then, sorry? Oh, sorry, I'm so sorry. And respond to Nicole's call to make this work about outcomes for real students in our classrooms and life opportunities. In my own particular work over the years in equity, it's so hard to move this discussion from that touchy-feely stuff to make it about really student achievement issues and gaps between certain groups of students and how they're achieving. And I would ask that we all try to kind of move this work into that realm so that we give every single student in our schools a chance to be successful and to be whatever they want to be beyond our school.
Okay, so we have a couple of comments and concerns around sort of administration, educational administration, and in that, what's the role of education, the administration, and resistance that you might meet at the board level. And then we have also a comment about sort of countervailing forces and the flooding of the system by sort of corporate sort of interests. And then finally, ending up talking about sort of how the challenges of really moving some of these conversations to ones about opportunity and student achievement. Okay. So these will be our last, you could think of those. Unfortunately, unfortunately, as your last set of comments for the evening. Sort of ominous. But so maybe if you feel comfortable, we can either go down the line or whoever would like to begin and bring us to close. And thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. Who would like to begin?
I can jump in with a little something around resistance in school boards. I'm sorry. A little bit about resistance in school boards and making large transformational change. I always crack a joke that when you start in research in any institution, you do a lot of literature reviews. It's kind of your pathway to research. And so recently I've been working on looking at large board transformation in terms of different priorities. And I think that some of the things we need to keep in mind is that transitions, especially of board size, take time. They take a lot of resources, they take a lot of people on the ground to mobilize. And one of the things I've come across is that sometimes there are pockets of success that are happening throughout boards. Sometimes an entire school can adopt a new cultural perspective that can be highlighted and shared in some way, and that can be a really effective way of broadening and getting people on board to make that transition.
Thank you.
One of the things that we will always come back to, should always come back to, what administrators are doing to support the work that we do. And of course, one of the things is that administrators will have their particular interests, and teachers will have their particular interests, and sometimes these differences do not talk well with each other. So the requirement is always the conversations that we're going to encourage between administrators and teachers so that everyone can be on the same page. And I'm quite sure that sometimes doesn't always happen. The work then that we need to do or must do or should do is fostering conversations in schools, not necessarily from the perspective of what school boards dictate, but sometimes what are some of the conditions of the school that teachers, students, and administrators see as absolutely critical if the school are going to move forward. I sometimes wonder, though, as we engage in these conversations, how nice labels such as doing anti-racism education or critical response pedagogy. I wonder how these become sometimes just nice catchwords that's convenient, but we do not dig deep beyond or pay attention to what they really asked us to do in terms of responding to the needs of students. So I want to think, and since Lance has already said that this is the last time I'm going to talk, just for tonight. It's absolutely critical that beyond just these catchphrases that we sometimes accept, that seem to sound good, actually, that we're going to really make commitments to, and I always come back to, the actual structural changes that we believe in, the systemic changes or the institutional conditions that we must critically examine and respond to and change if we're going to do the education work that we say we are committed to doing. And I'm always thinking that it's going to take not only teachers within the classrooms and students, but also the relationships that we build outside of the school as well.
All right. I came into this conversation feeling, I've been struggling lately with the notion of culture and how it's used. And I came into this kind of curious about how we as a panel are going to handle it. And I think I'm coming out of it even more convinced that the focus on culture is problematic. And it's not problematic because what we intend to do through that focus, but it's problematic on how it allows people off the hook. Racism is not a cultural issue. It is not an intercultural issue or a multicultural issue. It is an issue of power, and it's an issue of how opportunity is distributed. And I can't get to that through power. I mean, I can't get to that through culture. I can get to that maybe through institutional culture. And so this is what I do when I work with schools. I say when we are talking about students and opportunity, we are going to talk about equity. Every time you say culture, I'm going to say equity. And I'm going to push the conversation back toward equity. Or we can talk about the institutional culture of racism. But this is just a fear of mine. I think we're so obsessed with culture, and culture is so vague, it means everything. Race is culture. Gender is not a culture. And I don't think race is a culture. I think racial groups might have some cultural things if they're near each other regionally, but even racial groups are culturally diverse. Religious groups are culturally diverse. And I think that's kind of what I'm taking away from this. I don't think, I mean, of course teachers need cultural awareness. Cultural competence, I think we can throw that away. I think that's ridiculous. I think it's a very low bar, and not the way you were talking about it, but the way that it's often talked about. In the US, my introduction to diversity education in the US was taco night. That's what I got in elementary school. That was my cultural competence. And the question is, what did that replace? You know, it replaced any conversation of something like US imperialist intervention in Latin America. I never got that. In place of that, I got taco night. So I feel even stronger now about, you know, what teachers need is not cultural competence. What teachers need is equity literacy. How do I recognize inequities and biases that are happening right in front of me in my own classroom, in my school, in my community? And how do I respond to those inequities? How do I create a more equitable learning environment? That is a whole different set of knowledge and skills from cultural competence or from cultural proficiency or multiculturalism or those sorts of things. I think what we need to talk about is equity literacy.
I like that. Equity, literacy, responsive, equity, responsive, and relevant. I like that. It's all good, it makes sense, because I agree, I totally agree, and that's why I showed the Dougie. I mean, it does get watered down, it gets taken up in ways that are comfortable for people and palatable, and some of the real issues get glossed over and don't talk about. So I totally agree, and if we did it in the ways that we described, I think it would be rich and meaningful and get us to those places where we made some movement. A couple things on the whole aspect of life opportunity and the what Jack had brought up. I really just think that, you know, when we do engage in some of this work, we do create spaces for engagement for kids where the system has not worked for them, where they have seen themselves as othered and marginalized. And I do think that when we increase opportunities for engagement, we have students who are more checked in, they feel like school is a place for me. When they see people who look like them too, who are brought in, when they find out that science isn't owned by this group of people over here that don't have any connection to where I am and where I'm from and the people who love me and all that, then they can see maybe there is a trajectory for me. They can see the possibilities that I talked about, Ferguson talking about. And I think when we think about learners who have historically been marginalized, I think we have to think about what we do in terms of context and content. When we take those skills and strategies and apply them to things that are meaningful in their lives, then it really does make a difference for engagement. And I think that is a huge piece that will give the students the opportunity to create their own paths. On the other points about the corporate forces and resistance, I really think we need to engage in education, and education for our educators around critically what happens in schools, and especially in schools that are in communities that are underserved, that face more poverty, where people come in and they want to pay you to do this and pay you to do that, and kids are taking down paths that maybe they don't need to go down, that doesn't give them at the end of the day all the choices that someone else's child might have. And I think for teachers to have the critical perspectives, as we all say all the time, well, we didn't learn this in school. school, you were having taco night, Paul, when you should have been having those critical conversations. So how do we build in places in our schools for that critical consciousness piece that we talked about, that critical conversation about these powers and things that go on in the world that are important? And last but not least, going back to Jillian's comment and the comment about administrators, administrators play a key role and teachers do as well. And I think that whole notion of how Jillian said this whole school kind of turned things around, it ties back to me a quote that I always remember. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that has."
Well, I want to thank our 4 speakers. That was amazing. Carl James, Paul Gorski, Jillian Parrott, and Nicole West Burns. A round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Lots of food of thought. The conversation will continue. Our speakers will be here for a couple of moments, and I hope to see you back here soon.